Welcome back, guys. It's the Advanced Photo Manipulation Movie Poster Effects course. My name is Kirk Nelson. We are now on lesson number 8. And in this lesson, we will deal with the weaponry. Okay, so first of all, this is where we left our giant fighting robot last time. We've filled in the majority of his mechanical parts. Now we need to give him something to fight with. One of the weapons at his disposal should be a nice shoulder gun here. And to do that, we'll make use of this photo, file number 0816, which happens to be a tank that has some really heavy artillery guns already placed on them. Now we won't only use the path that's surrounding the guns here, but we'll also create a selection of this base part as well so that we can copy those over onto his shoulder using the exact same techniques that we used in the previous lesson to fill out his mechanical parts. Okay, so we've got our shoulder gun brought in here. You can see the individual layers. This is the shoulder gun mount, which, as you can tell, is just the base portion of this tank, and then I used the selection of the path that we saw to create the guns here on top of it. Now I've desaturated both of those elements so we don't get the same lighting and coloring that was in the original photo. It's still that same slate gray that we want to use for our robot here. I've hand painted in some of the shadowing, but there's one other thing that really needs to be done with this gun, and that's because the perspective from the photo is taken really close to where these barrels are, and so there's some dramatic perspective shift in these gun barrels, which kind of throws off the whole sense of scale of our giant robot here. So these are going to need to be adjusted, but that's why I pulled these in as a separate element from the mounted part, because you're going to want to use the distortion transformation to pull in the corners so that you're working against the perspective that's already built into the photo. Now, as you're dragging this around, if you're feeling it popping to things and you can't quite get the corners where you want because it seems to not go where you want it to, that's because the snap is turned on, and it could be snapping to any number of things that is available for it to snap to. To get rid of that, you just turn off the snap in the view menu, and then things will move around a lot smoother. Okay, so now that he's got some long-range artillery here, let's give him some melee weapon too. So let's put a nice sharp-edged weapon here in his other hand. We'll put a blazing green sword coming out of this sword mount that we've created before. So to work on that, let's use this file here, photo number 0791. This photo was taken inside a museum that had an exhibit that was a very shiny piece of metal here, and I thought that that would work really well for the texture to use for a sharp, shiny sword. But first, we need to straighten that out a little bit, because it helps if the construction of the weapon is done in a vertical manner, because it's difficult to work at some angles first. We can angle it later on. We should start with a nice vertical slab to work with. So now we take our pen tool, we use a path, and we quickly just sketch in a large, almost trapezoidal shape to use as the basis for the sword. Okay, then we'll use that shape as a vector mask to begin the creation of our weapon here. Just having a sharpened rectangle does not make it a sword. We need to add a lot more to that. It'd be cool to have some areas that are carved out of the inside of the metal there. Okay, now while this texture looks really good, these parallel lines showing the different plates don't really work for a bladed weapon. That looks more like panels than anything else. So we can get rid of those using a couple different methods. The spot healing brush can be a good option, although sometimes it tends to leave some areas that need additional touch-ups. Or if that tends to be a little bit stubborn, you can always use the clone tool as a standby. Okay, now with that, it's starting to look a little more sword-like. But let's add a little notch down here for the weapon. So I'm going to use the pen tool and once again, create another path for us to use. So that appears to be more sword-like. Okay, so now that we've got the basic shape down and the material itself in there, it's time to do the trick that makes it look a lot more like an actual edged weapon. And that has to do with the shading. Now, this is an old illustration technique. Well, first of all, let's create a new layer and make sure that layer is clipped to this sword here. Now, I'm going to very carefully create a very sharp inset area along the weapon. Okay, now with that selection active, you want to grab a soft brush with a very low hardness. And you'll even start with a low opacity at about 30%. Make sure the paint is at white color. And just begin painting along that inside edge of the selection you just made. Okay, and then scale it down really far. Increase the opacity to maybe about 60. Increase the hardness too. And just add a little bit of gleam just to the edges of the weapon. Now, when you're happy with the way that looks, inverse the selection. You can do that through selection, inverse, and then change the paint color to black and do a very similar type thing, but with the shadow areas just on the other side of that cut. Then when you release the selection, you'll see how it's looking a lot more like an actual bladed weapon now. Let's do that same technique, but to create a type of back groove on the other side of the main sharpened side. Okay, so we've got a darkened back edge there and a front sharpened edge with a slight gleam or a glint right to the very edge of the metal. It's time to add a little bit of a bevel and emboss now, just to give a touch of depth to the inside portions of the blade. Okay, so now we create the ever popular merged layer at the top. We'll just call this sword. And then we'll drag this in to our main project composition and transform it into place. Okay, so then the next step is to mask out the sword area so that it folds right in with this mount on his wrist there. So let's add a mask and then create a curved area that's right about in line with the cuff of that mount. Inverse the selection and then just paint out the area that should not be visible. So next, let's add a gleaming highlight that runs right down the middle of this sword. So I'm going to create a new layer, call it sword highlight, create a reflected gradient with the foreground to transparent preset. Actually, we don't need it the whole height of the canvas, so we'll create a quick selection here. Just a very narrow highlight that we can then transform to fit right along the sword blade. So I've transformed mine down to be a very narrow highlight, and I've also angled it to match with the sword. So once we clip it to the sword, you can see how it runs along that blade to create a highlight that very well mimics the highlight we see in the mount from the original photograph. So at this point, it's just a matter of adding in some shadow area, because that always helps to ground new elements into the composition, is to get the shading and the shadowing proper. All right, we've got our sword worked out here. I'm going to group that all together through layer, group layers, and just call it sword. Okay guys, that brings lesson 8 to a close. We've seen how to use some photo illustration techniques to add some weaponry to our robot. Our next lesson, lesson number 9, we will start adding a little bit more realism to it by using custom scratch and rust effects.